Okay. Good morning, Epidemics. Sorry I was a little bit late getting started today. All right. How's everybody doing today? Well, Jerry's doing good. That's nice to see. Oop. All right. Nothing new on the announcements today. Just reminding you guys, there's stuff due this week. A quiz, a journal entry, and your project request, all due before midnight on Sunday, March 6th. And of course, spring break is coming up the week of March 14th through 18th. So we're going to have a little bit of a break soon. All right, we have been talking about the 1918 flu pandemic. And this pandemic was definitely, as a percentage of the population, deadlier than the COVID pandemic we are currently experiencing. It's the closest type of pandemic that we can compare to COVID, because flu is a respiratory virus. COVID is spread as a respiratory virus, even though it attacks primarily the circulatory system. A lot of the damage from COVID is damage to the circulatory system, but it is something that can help us get some perspective on the current situation. Now, the 1918 flu pandemic lasted for between 2 and 3 years, depending on where you were. And at the time, we did not know what caused the flu. We had not identified the virus. So how do we know now, looking back, that it was caused by the flu, the same virus that circulates every winter here now? Well, in the late 1990s, scientists got permission to dig up some graves in Alaska. So this is a mass grave site in Alaska. You can see all of the crosses up here. So they buried a lot of the population of their town. 72 out of the 80 adults. 8 adults survived it. So the rest of them had to be buried in a mass grave. And we looked in Alaska because the permafrost preserves the bodies. That layer under the ground that basically stays frozen. So they took tissue samples from the lungs of these people and isolated and sequenced the flu virus. So they confirmed that it was definitely the flu. A second team was working on the same idea, sequencing the virus, and they were able to isolate it from preserved lung tissue taken from a 21-year-old service member who died in September of 1918. And a third group worked on a sample from another service member who also died of the flu. Now, the flu virus breaks down just like our bodies break down. If it's in your tissues when you die, it's not going to last that long. So none of these samples provided a complete sequence, but these 3 groups were able to combine their sequences and create a complete sequence of the virus. So they isolated it, they sequenced it, and now we can compare the genetics of the 1918 strain to modern flu viruses and see if we can figure out why it was so deadly. Well, disturbingly, the 1918 strain did not have any of the known virulence factors. Virulence has an E, not an A. What are virulence factors? What do you think virulence factors are? Do we remember what virulence means, or have I talked about that one? Okay, virulence.
I got it. Yeah,
okay.
I found the severity of harmfulness of a disease, a poison.
Yes, how harmful or severe something is. Absolutely. So a virulence factor is a gene that we know makes a virus, or bacteria cause a more severe infection. Okay. So we didn't find any virulence factors that we know of, which on the one hand is good because it means that the virulence factors in the 1918 flu aren't spreading around in modern times. That's good, right? But it also means we don't know what made that virus so incredibly deadly. And to try and figure out why it was so deadly, scientists decided that they needed to very, very carefully recreate the virus and infect cells in tissue culture and eventually mice and see what happens. Now, this was an incredibly deadly virus. We don't have, like with smallpox, we have a vaccine kind of tucked away. We know how to make that vaccine. We don't know how to make a vaccine to the 1918 flu. So that's a concern, right? We don't have a lot of good medical treatment for flu. We have supportive care, a few drugs. So what they did was one person worked on this in what's called an enhanced BSL-3. So this means he had to use a retinal scanner to get in. He was on a prophylactic or preventative antiviral drug that works against flu. And if he got infected, he would be placed in solitary quarantine. He knew this. He agreed to these terms. All right, I'm out of space. So if you want a screenshot, take it. So what did he find? He found that the 1918 strain replicated much faster than modern flus. It spread very rapidly through the lungs of the mice and caused severe lung damage very quickly. when they started doing the math, they found it was at least 100 times more lethal than the modern strains of the flu, which is, you know, what you kind of expect. Now, one of the things they did was they replaced several of the genes with modern genes. So they took certain genes of the 1918 flu, replaced them with equivalent genes from the modern flu. And basically, if you replaced pretty much any of the genes, it was less lethal. So it was a combination of genes that made it so deadly. Is this making sense to everybody? Got questions?
What year was this that they were splicing?
In the 1990s.
Okay. Because when did they find that protein that they used, that protein gel that they used to you know, separate DNA or whatever? Wasn't that around the same time? So this is super cutting edge technology at that time.
Agarose gels, I think, is what you're thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty old technology.
Oh, cheers.
So we've been able to separate DNA for a long time. The new technology makes the process much, much faster. But let's see, PCR, I think, was discovered in the 80s, but we now have electronic sequencers, computer operated sequencers, which make it fast. Much, much faster than we used to be able to do it. Okay. Screenshot if you need it. All right. So to understand a little bit about the context of the 1918 flu, life in 1918. This is my grandmother, approximately 1918. At this time, indoor plumbing was rare. Half of all families lived and worked on farms. Half of all children lived in poverty. Most did not attend high school. And the majority of boys started working around age 14. So things were very, very different. Medical care was not as good as it is nowadays. We didn't have antibiotics. We didn't have a lot of the vaccines we have today. And, you know, it was a much harder life than what we experience in the modern world. So during this time, the 1918 flu started. And it showed up for the first time in Haskell County, Kansas, early in 1918. A physician, Dr. Loring Miner, began noticing cases of flu that were more severe than he'd seen in previous years. The patients were sicker, a lot more of them died, and it was impacting healthy young men. Which is unusual. Generally speaking, healthy young adults are the group that are least likely to have severe illness from a contagious disease or to die from a contagious disease. This is kind of when our immune systems work their best. But he was seeing late teens, 20-something men getting sick and dying of the flu. He contacted the state health officials. Yeah, they weren't interested. He did publish his findings, however, which is how we know this is where the epidemic started. This lasted for a few months. There were not enough vulnerable or susceptible people to keep the epidemic going in rural Kansas. And if it had stayed in rural Kansas, it would have just burned out. And we wouldn't have had the pandemic that we have. But there was World War I going on. So those young men who were catching the flu, some of them traveled to Camp Funston, an army camp in Kansas. And it's the military and the World War that allowed the 1918 flu to spread around the world and cause so much death. The US was sending troops to Europe to support the Allies, and a lot of young men were signing up to fight in the war. So at the military bases, the barracks were often overcrowded. They hadn't planned to have a world war, so they hadn't built up facilities, right? So a lot of troops would be sleeping in tents, and they would sleep outside in tents even in the middle of winter. There was a lack of warm clothing and bedding for these men. And because it was wartime and all of the men who worked on the farm were heading out, there was a lot of food shortages too. Malnutrition was widespread. And at this time period, we were still losing a quarter of all children born before the age of 5. And in large part, malnutrition was involved in this. And just like today, people were under a kind of high level of stress, which weakens the immune system. So I'm going to have to disappoint the cat and quit petting him so I can type some more. On March 4th, 1918, a cook at Camp Funston reported ill with the flu. They were sick with the flu. Within 3 weeks, 1,100 soldiers were hospitalized with the flu. Now, only 38 died. The flu at this point, while severe, more severe than normal, it wasn't as bad as it would get. It would eventually mutate and become more severe. By March 18th, the flu had spread to 2 military bases in Georgia, and 10% of the soldiers there were sick. By April, it arrived in Europe, specifically France. Okay, screenshot if you need it. So this is the flu virus. It doesn't look like much, right? This is an electron microscope image. All right. When we talk about the 1918 flu, it is one of the top 10 known killers on a per capita basis. What percentage of the population was killed off? We don't have an exact death toll. I think I have a couple of different ranges depending on what my source was at that point in my notes when I was writing this up. But we estimate it was between 50 and 100 million, which was between 2 and 3% of the world's population. That's pretty bad. Different areas had different fatality rates. Some cities were basically wiped out, like that place in Alaska where 90% of the adults were killed. Others did not have very high fatality rates. Half of these deaths were in people between 20 and 40 years old. So unlike flu nowadays, which affects very young infants and older people, this flu was infecting and killing people in their prime. And it's estimated that 1 out of 3 people got sick with this flu. Over the 2 to 3 years of the pandemic. So there has been a lot of discussion about, was Kansas the origin? But the early detection in Kansas by that doctor, Dr. Miner, the clear route of transmission, we can trace it from Haskell County to the military base, from that military base to other military bases, and then through the US military into France. It's pretty obvious that's it. Some people try to say, no, it started in France. But I think it's pretty obvious it started here. Well, in Kansas. I'm going to go on to the next page. Julia, go ahead.
This was the same that they referred to as the Spanish influenza, right?
Yes, and thank you for that transition, because
No,
that's
I was going to ask if we were ever going to cover why that it's called that.
We're going to call it right now. We're going to explain that right now. Perfect timing to ask that question. Thank you. Why was it called the Spanish flu? It did not start in Spain. What was going on is during World War I, England, France, Germany, the US were all censoring their news, trying to keep information about the war scaled down, kind of, trying to not upset the people, keeping up popular support for the war and making the US look better, right? We're winning the war and we're strong and powerful. Spain was neutral. They were not censoring their news. So Spain was talking about influenza in their news. Soldiers in Europe were finding out about the flu from the Spanish news. And so that is why it was called the Spanish flu, because they were the only news talking about it. There was a law passed in 1918 called the Sedition Act, which prohibited disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the US government, its flags, or its armed forces, or that caused others to view the American government or its institutions with contempt. They just completely decided to ignore the First Amendment because we were at war.
No gag order, basically.
Basically a gag order, yes. But it was on the press. It was on the public. So, nowadays, if we want to go, the US government sucks, they're not very good, blah, 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 we can say that. But in 1918, if I had said that okay, being a woman, I probably wouldn't have been in front of a class of students. But if I had said that in front of a class of students, I would be arrested and put in jail for it. All right. Okay, so this is a ward of sick civilians during the 1918 flu. Notice it looks kind of like what? A concert hall, maybe a theater, looking at these seats. Just like nowadays, there was a lack of hospital beds. We're seeing the same kind of thing today. Not enough hospital beds and not enough nurses. Now, I mentioned that this strain was impacting the young adults, which is very unusual. So why was that? There are two hypotheses. One states that the older adults had immunity because they were exposed to a similar strain and had that immune memory, which allowed their immune system to strike back a little faster. The other one was that it was actually the strong immune system caused a lot of damage. And that's what caused a lot of the harm and a lot of the deaths, was an over response by the immune system. We see that with COVID sometimes as well. A strong immune system, a strong immune response can cause damage to our bodies. and these people died fast. Fatality was in about 24 to 48 hours. So nowadays, of course, we know the flu usually lasts between 1 and 2 weeks. But back then, you got it, and that was it.
Was there anyone who but there were people who were able to survive the influenza, was there?
Yes, yes,
This is just average.
yes. This was the average for those who died from it.
What
Yeah,
actually killed
my-
them? I'm sorry, go ahead, Julia.
Sorry, thank you. My great-grandfather's mom died of the influenza, and she died on his birthday. She died on the hospital lawn because they didn't have any room in the hospital.
Yeah. My grandmother that I showed you earlier, one of her friends died in the 1918 flu, and she was in the cemetery at the burial, and they saw multiple other parents of her classmates
Wow.
at the same time burying their high school children.
Jeez.
Yeah. Jerry, did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh yeah. So what technically killed them? What part of their body shut down as a result of this?
That's a very good question. And there are two parts to this. With the flu, the primary damage was to the lungs. So it was lung failure that killed most of them. The other part of the damage would be because of the immune response. Things like a fever. That's your immune system trying to fight off an infection. But if you have a fever that is too high, that lasts for too long, it kills brain cells.
Yeah.
But most of them, it was from the lung damage. Yep. Okay. When I want to go to the whiteboard for just a quick second. So our estimates of the dead are probably underestimates. And even today, when we have estimates of deaths caused by a disease, they're often underestimated. Now, why is that? Nate, go ahead.
I forget the term for it. I know we were talking about this during our discussion of COVID, but it's the people that died through indirect causes of the illness, like I forget the term for it. I wish I knew it. You definitely know it. I know that. But so byproducts of the pandemic that caused ancillary deaths due to be hospitals full or certain circumstances that preceded the pandemic.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Lots of people die during pandemics for reasons other than the disease itself. In the case of the 1918 flu, a lot of the people who died were young adults. They would have young children. So a lot of children were orphaned. And during this time period, orphans had a much higher likelihood of not surviving to adulthood. A lot of them were young farm workers. There was a lot of malnutrition. So that's going to increase indirect deaths. the hospitals were crowded. That's going to increase indirect deaths. You're absolutely right on all of those. Now,
Sorry to interject. Do you remember
Yeah.
the term though? Because there was a specific, I could go rewatch the like second or third YouTube video in the archive, but I know there's a term for it. And I remember that because I remember you wrote it on a whiteboard, very similar to this one.
I'm trying to remember. I can think of lots of other ways to say indirect deaths, but I'm not pulling that particular word out of the back of my brain right now.
That's all right. I'll skim through the YouTube real fast. See maybe if I can strike gold.
Let me know if you find it.
Plus, they had poor record taking abilities. I say practices.
Yes,
It was on paper. Paper, disintegrates after a while, or someone can make a mistake, or a fire can happen, so on and so forth.
absolutely. Poor records. How about misdiagnoses? Either accidental or deliberate. Julia.
Is there any, I had another reason.
Yeah.
Possibly. Well, I don't know. This is just experience with the last government administration, but misinformation.
Yep. That I would put under misdiagnoses.
Okay.
Misinformation, absolutely, especially during this time period when there was World War I raging in Europe and we had that 1918 Sedition Act. Absolutely.
That was it, Nate.
There we go. Indirect deaths. Good job.
I got lucky. I clicked on a video, it was popped right to it. So didn't
Wait,
take me
what?
too long.
What's excess morality?
Excess mortality are the indirect deaths. The
Oh,
people who died during the pandemic because of conditions the pandemic caused, even though they didn't die of that particular disease. In this example, 1918 flu.
Oh, okay.
Some people probably didn't even go to the hospital and just died at home as well. Many people, indigenous people, probably people of color, women, so on and so forth.
Yeah,
Did you have to pay? Was it free? Was
no, healthcare.
there health insurance back in those days?
I don't think they had any health insurance. Medical costs were not as astronomically high as they are now compared to salaries. But yeah, you would have to pay for medical care. Nate, go ahead.
Just wanted to expand on the misinformation. I think something equally powerful was just the lack of information. Especially at a time pre-1940s, probably not as much medical advancements, as there were even 50 years ago. So there was stuff probably people just didn't even know, like transmissibility from surfaces or mucous membranes, all that stuff. So
Yep. Good point. You guys came up with some really good ones here. There's one other that I have on my notes. Who to report to. The CDC is kind of the repository for this information, and it only requires certain diseases to be reported. So many of these diseases are not that common. The CDC requires reporting because you want to catch it before it becomes a problem. So it would be things like rabies, Ebola. Nate, go ahead.
sorry, I keep raising my hand, but if I'm correct, wasn't the CDC, it wasn't established till the mid-1940s. So if there was a predecessor to the CDC, what was it? And I'm sure the capabilities must have been dramatically reduced than what we know and have today.
Yeah, the CDC wasn't created until the 1940s. So that comment here about the CDC, that's for modern times.
I guess what I was going with that was there wasn't exactly a uniform, centralized medical advisory governmental institution. So that probably factored into a lot too.
Yes, absolutely. I'm trying to say one word and write another one. So there was no, you're absolutely right, Nate. There was no centralized institution to report to. So the data that we have on deaths, where do we have this information from?
Morgues?
Right. Going back and looking at death certificates, if they still exist.
Localized hospital records.
Yep, hospital records. Very, very importantly, the census. So the federal census, hang on a second, I want to check something real quick. Even Social Security didn't exist at this point. So the census was kind of the government's way of keeping track, in the US at least, of death rates and birth rates and that sort of information. Okay, going to go back to the PowerPoint. Guys had some good points there. We still have underreporting of diseases today for some of the same reasons and some different ones. Regardless of exactly how many died, the life expectancy that year went down. So what is life expectancy?
How long you expected to live on average, I guess?
Close.
Healthy, a healthy, normal.
No,
healthy.
no, you're going further away.
It's a projection of, I don't know if it's a projection or if they, or I know it's an average.
Yes.
I think of how long people live in a certain region, country. And here you can see a big dip around 1920. So
Yeah, that big dip is the 1918 flu right there.
A super dip.
Super dip. So these are years. This is life expectancy. Now, the average age at death. And this is for everyone. So back here in 1830, if we look at Sweden, because they're right here on the line, the average life expectancy was 40.
What?
Did that mean people generally lived to be 40? No.
and you said that was 1830, right? Just to clarify.
1830, yep.
Okay, yeah.
40 years old.
I believe it, yeah.
That was not that people lived to be 40. That was that if you count up everyone who was born and all of those kids who died before the age of 5 and count their ages of death, plus the people who lived to be 70 or 80, count up all of their ages and average them, that's what we're talking about. So generally speaking, historically, if you made it to puberty and you were a guy, your life expectancy would be, or you were most likely would survive to 70. If you were a woman, you have to make it past first childbirth. But if you made it past your first childbirth, you would probably make it to 70. Nate, go ahead.
And that was because, like you just said, the vast amount of diseases that killed children, especially young ages.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So this is something that a lot of people get confused about. And they go, oh, yes, everybody died at age 40 in Sweden in the 1830s. No, lots of children died, but the adults generally lived into their 70s. So the example I have in my notes to make this very, very simple, you have twins. One dies before 1 year old. One lives to 70. Their life expectancy is 35, right? Okay. Some of this was World War II, but I'm not sure exactly why it impacted Finland and Spain more than anywhere else. But you really can see this big dip in every place on this graph in 1918.
Seems like Finland was hit the hardest consistently than any other place. Does it dip at like 1870? I'm not going to Finland, I guess.
Yeah. Nowadays, here's the United States down here below everybody else. Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, Spain. They all have much higher life expectancies than Americans do. Our
Calories,
life
calories are killing us.
It's not calories, it's healthcare.
Oh, it is?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Nate, I'm going to get to you in a second. Switzerland, Spain, Sweden, Norway, and Finland all have almost completely free healthcare.
Wow.
People, the ones that I like to hear about are the women who give birth, and the only thing they have to pay for is parking and snacks.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Nate, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I don't know why it's not listed there, but I think Japan is like the highest in the world. I think it's around like 83 or something like that.
Yeah, Japan's really high.
I think the oldest person to ever lived on the island of Hokkaido to like 123 or something crazy like that.
Yeah, but remember what we said about records not being great?
That's a fair point, yeah.
Yeah.
But I still think the Japanese live longer on average, just living in that country for like 4 to 5 years.
Yeah.
There's vast differences that are awesome there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right there. Why it wasn't on this list, I just randomly selected some countries to throw up here. And most of them were in the S's just because I was, scrolling down and I just clicked a whole bunch of S's in a row. That's all it was. Okay. You guys understand why life expectancy doesn't say how long you are going to live. All right, good. Screenshot if you need them. I see Nate's or not Nate. Jerry's already taken his. Ah. There's a comment in the chat about a movie called Escape Fire. It's available on the North Shore Library site, talking about the US healthcare system and how it's Yeah, I'm going to agree with disgraceful. All right. So let's talk about the progress of the 1918 flu. There were several waves. We see this with COVID, right? We had the Delta wave, and then cases went down, and then we had Omicron, and cases are coming down from that. The first wave generally went from March through August of 1918. And this impacted a lot of the military. So we know that 10% of British troops in France were too sick to report for duty. Nate, go ahead.
So that range of months, that's where the virus thrives.
For the
That's-
1918 flu, that was the first wave of people getting sick, lots of people getting sick and lots of people dying.
Oh, okay, I didn't know if that was like a seasonal strength, whereas like the dichotomy, I guess, of today's flu, whereas that surges during winter months. Or is
Right.
that not what this graph or chart is saying at all?
You've got a really good point, and that's one of those things that is still poorly understood. Flu tends to hit during winter months. Why is that? That's an excellent question. We've got some ideas, but we don't have a good answer for it. So the 1918 flu, the first wave, going through the summer, why was that? We don't have a good answer for that, and why it was different than modern flu. So sorry, Nate, I don't have a good answer. Yeah, people talk about temperature. People tend to be indoors more during the winter, and in modern times, you know, back in the 1918, a lot of people worked outdoors, but it was farming, so they were outdoors in the summer and just kind of not doing that much during the winter. But nowadays it makes sense to have a lot of diseases in the winter because we all are in buildings and interacting with each other. But that just wasn't the case in 1918. We also see increases in contagious diseases right after school starts in the fall, right after school starts again in January, right after spring break, because people tend to travel during the summers and the breaks, and they bring things back with them and spread them to their friends and family.
That term, it's communicable, right?
Communicable.
Spread.
Yes, yes. All right, so March through August, flu was bad, and then it kind of faded. And there were a couple of, there wasn't a long fade. And the second wave started in late September. At Camp Devens, which was outside Boston area. And this was more fatal. It was obviously some mutations happened between the first wave and the second wave. So now you got to a point where 20% of soldiers were too sick to get out of bed. So that was twice as many people were getting sick. And now we started to see something called cyanosis. has anybody heard of cyanosis? Does
I know
anybody know?
cyan is a shade of blue.
Thank you. Yes. People were literally turning blue because they weren't getting enough oxygen.
Isn't that called hypoxia?
Yes. Yes, that's absolutely what it is. We also saw in the second wave bleeding from mucous membranes, which is not typical of the flu. So people would bleed from their eyes, their gums would bleed, nose, ears, anus, bleeding from basically every hole in the body. Coughing was also worse. And it could injure muscles. So you could strain muscles because you were coughing so hard. Autopsies showed two things. One was brain damage, and one was lungs that were literally falling apart. And just like we're seeing with COVID, we would see long-term changes in people's mentality, in their ability to think, and in their personality. In fact, the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, supposedly became more aggressive, stubborn, and argumentative. Yeah, Nate, go ahead.
Now, when you describe change in personality, is that akin to toxoplasmosis, like we talked about earlier this semester? Like how they became more, what was it, dogmatic, jealous, less impulsive? I mean, I know they're not the same, but is it that same theory?
Yeah, it's a similar theory. We think that the flu caused brain damage, and for some reason, the where the brain damage seemed to occur changed personalities.
So I think that's the cerebrum, right? That's the part of your brain that controls emotion. Okay.
The cerebrum, yep. Probably primarily in the frontal region. This may have contributed, the whole flu may have contributed to ending World War I. It's hard to say for sure if it did, but we had so many soldiers dying that may have contributed. Woodrow Wilson becoming more aggressive meant that he was more aggressive on the war front as well. And so he would choose riskier tactics and have the American troops be more aggressive on the ground, which may have contributed to the Allies winning that war. But at the end of World War I, the losing side was severely punished. Now, I mean, it always happens that the losing side gets some kind of punishment from the winning side, but it was much harsher than it had been for previous wars. And the harsh punishments of World War I definitely contributed to building animosity that would help lead to World War II. So what role did the military clearly helped spread the flu? What role did the flu have in the end of the war? It clearly had some kind of impact, but without going back in time and rerunning history without the flu, we can't say for sure exactly what it caused, but it definitely contributed to some of the stuff going on there.
So Australia and New Zealand are the safest places to live, is what you're saying. Cool. I'm out of here.
Have you been paying attention to the news out of Australia lately?
Damn it. No.
It's on fire again.
Is it on fire too? I know it's got some serious flooding.
I thought I saw someplace that there were areas that were on fire.
That wouldn't surprise me. Australia does like to burn.
Yeah.
I do know that part of Australia got almost 3 feet of rain in a 24-hour period recently.
When are we going to start caring about the planet?
I care.
No, I mean like
Powerful people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nate, did you have your hand up again?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to your statement about how the Germans were severely punished after World War I. If I remember correctly, the Treaty of Versailles, they got their economy pretty much ruined. And again, I'm not making an argument for Germany, or I'm just telling you what happened. Their economy got ruined, and I believe they tried to like attenuate they pretty much blamed it on the Jewish population in Germany, and that's what led to World War II, pretty
Yep.
much.
Yeah. Jerry, did you have something
barely
to add?
punished.
No, I was just saying, yep, that's pretty much right.
Okay. Was that Julia talking?
I was talking to myself. I didn't mean to turn my microphone on, but I was saying that they were barely, I don't know, learning about World War II. I feel like World War II, there were a lot more harsher punishments that needed to be dealt out, but there weren't.
Yeah. World War II was definitely worse in some ways than World War I. Absolutely. Okay. There's one more weird symptom that we would see during this second wave, and that would be patients would develop air pockets under their skin. Really bizarre symptom, right? When the nurses would turn patients in the bed, they said it would make crackling sounds. Yeah. All right. Screenshots.
I think this class should be mandatory for everybody in higher education. I promise you that.
Thanks for that, Jerry. Okay. During the second wave, the city of Philadelphia in the fall of 1918 decided to hold a parade to boost morale. Health officials, doctors all said, hell no, don't do that. We're in the middle of a flu pandemic. Philadelphia ignored the advice. Does this sound familiar to anybody? And so what happened, they held the parade right here, late September. And a couple of days later, literally a couple of days later, the flu cases started going through the roof and the deaths started going up. This is death rates. And the death rate went up, up, up. And on one day in October, this peak day here, 759 people died in one day because of influenza. Without the flu, the death rate or the number of people who died in Philadelphia on an average week due to all causes was about half of that. You can see that compared to St. Louis, who followed public health suggestions. They had a much lower death rate during that same time period. Juliana, I don't think Trump held a rally in 1918.
Oh no, I was saying that like the fact that like he held Trump rallies during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, I know what you meant, but I had to tease you about that one.
Oh, he's actually a time traveler, don't you know?
Oh,
He'll be back in 50 years. No, I'm just kidding.
well, at least I won't be around for that one. Okay, so that was the second wave. There was a third wave in the winter and in the spring of 2019, or not 2019. Here I go, 1919. And that wave, again, was deadly, but it was the last wave of the pandemic. And by summer 1919, it was over. So when we talk about the 1918 flu pandemic as the best pandemic to compare COVID against, unfortunately, a lot of people who are in charge of this sort of thing look back at the 1918 flu and said, oh yeah, it only lasted a year and a half. So COVID's only going to last a year and a half. Oh, there were 3 waves and then it was over with. So COVID's only going to have 3 waves and then it's over with. Instead of, it's like they're expecting COVID to do exactly the same thing as the 1918 flu pandemic. And it's not. What kind of lessons do we need to take? One is that even in 1918, masking worked. It helped reduce deaths. It helped reduce contagion. There were multiple waves. The first wave was not the deadliest. There is nothing to say that we won't have, I hate to do this to you guys, another wave of COVID that is even deadlier. We could. There's nothing to say that that won't happen. Diseases do not always get milder with time. All right. Are there any questions or comments at this point before we wrap up for the day?
I don't have, my comment is that I agree with Jerry that this class should be mandatory.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to have government officials sit through this class. The people in charge of things like mask mandates and all right. If there aren't any questions, we'll wrap it up here and I will see you guys next week. Have a good weekend. Nate, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just figured I'd save you the time of reading the email. I wanted to do the opioid pandemic, a PowerPoint